It's prediction time. So, my best prediction is the question is going to be about Scrooge and the relationship with poverty in the novel. Does it matter if my prediction is wrong? No. At the end of the video, I'm going to relate it to all those themes, so anything that could come up. And during the video, you'll see that it will fit 50% of any character that comes up. So even if that's not the exact question, you're going to be able to use most of this in the exam. My hit rate is about 50%. That was my worst year. So there's a 50% chance that this will come up. Let's go through the essay plan. So I always start with a thesis that has 3 parts. So why did Dickens write this novel? He wanted to change the attitude of the Victorian readers to the poor. But this book was priced at 5 shillings, therefore only the rich could afford it. So he's aiming it at rich people in order to change their views. He wants social change. In order to get that social change, he has to entertain them. And so he picks a Christmas story that will be read at Christmas so that he can link that to the idea of giving, but also to the Christian tradition, which is going to be important in persuading Christian readers to have a much more giving and charitable approach to poor people. Number 2, he starts off by characterising in a very hyperbolic, exaggerated, in this hyperbolic way, he describes Scrooge, wheezing, squeezing, I can't even remember the rest of the quote. He is a covetous old sinner. That's the end of the quote. That's the important bit, because sin takes us back to that idea of Christianity, and Dickens is suggesting if you're a Christian, you don't want to be a sinner. How was Scrooge a sinner? He didn't pay high enough wages and he didn't give charity to the poor. Therefore, dear rich reader, do not be like Scrooge. Then we have his attitude to the poor, which comes from the Reverend Thomas Malthus. And this is where Scrooge says to the charity collectors, are there no workhouses? And if they would rather not, then they had better die, if they'd rather not go to the workhouses. So this seems like an extraordinarily cruel view. However, Dickens' point is, all right, Scrooge is a miser, he's an old sinner, but actually he shares exactly the same views as many of his readers, because the workhouse was a response from government to the poor. We'll take them off the streets, we'll put them in these houses where they'll all live jointly together in bunks, terrible conditions, and then we'll make them work all day because we believe that the poor are simply lazy. The poor deserve their poverty. Dickens' point of view is totally different. The poor are kept poor by the social system. In particular, they're not given the education they need in order to improve their lives. That's going to be really important in this essay because it's the origin story of the book. When Dickens went looking for something to write about, he actually wanted to write a political pamphlet that campaigned for children being taken out of factories and for a better education for children. And these are things that he realised he couldn't make any money out of, and so he thought, well, how am I going to combine my social message with making some money? I know, I'll write a bestseller about Christmas, but I'll put in all my political messages. So that's why he attacks Thomas Malthus, because that's the political belief that most rich people had at the time. Then we have the idea of emotional poverty, which explains Scrooge's miserliness. So it can't just be a political novel. He wants to give a psychological reason for why Scrooge is so mean. But the other thing that does is it says to the reader, look, you didn't have the childhood that Scrooge had, so you've got no excuse for being such a miser. And I'll show you in a minute how he accuses every single reader of being just like a miser. This quotation helps us link it to fatherhood. Father is so much kinder now. That's what Fan says to the infant, not the infant, the child Scrooge, when she comes to collect him one Christmas. So what we've got here is a transformation. A father who's cruel, who then becomes kind and rescues Scrooge. And that's the same journey that Scrooge is going to go through. At the end, he's going to become a second father to Tiny Tim. It's exactly the same journey, but Dickens' point is, dear rich reader, you all have to become symbolically fathers to the poor. So, next we get to that transformation in Scrooge. What makes him think about becoming a father-like figure? It's when the ghost of Christmas Present takes him to see Tiny Tim at Christmas. Suddenly, he forms an attachment. He realises that Tiny Tim, this crippled boy who's obviously underfed and undernourished, and they're not getting enough of a Christmas spread to actually feed everyone properly, and this is their biggest meal of the year, Tiny Tim is going to die. And so he asks the ghost, is he going to die? And the ghost says, he says, if Tiny Tim will live. And the ghost said, yep, this is the shadow of the future. If things don't change, Tiny Tim is going to die. And then he uses Scrooge's words against him, which is, then he had better die. You told us earlier, didn't you, that, they'd better die. He uses those words not just to change Scrooge, but to change the reader, because the reader's the person who also believes in workhouses, who also believes in prisons, who also believes if they ain't going to improve their lot, they deserve what's coming to them. Okay, then we have this extraordinary ignorance and want. I mean, they're not needed for the plot. These are these two childlike ghost figures who happen to be in the skirts or the cloak of Christmas Present. And, Scrooge just sees them poking out. Has a look at them. They look dishevelled, they look dirty. And the boy, who is ignorant, has got doom written across his head. And the girl, who's just poor, has nothing written on her head. Now, what's going on there? Well, Dickens is saying, look, it's all right just treating people as poor people, putting them in workhouses, but what's going to be the consequence of that? If you don't educate them, they will never be able to rise up the social ladder. They will only ever be able to do menial jobs. But all the jobs that pay money need people to be able to read and write. You've got to educate the poor if you want to stop them being poor. If you don't do that, it's going to spell doom, not just for the poor, but for society. And that's why he uses the word beware. It's a warning to the reader that if we do not improve the education and therefore the lives of the poor, they will band together and rise up. The novel that he had just written before A Christmas Carol was A Tale of Two Cities, which was about the French Revolution. 3 years after this novel was published, A Christmas Carol, revolution spread across Europe. Why? Because the poor rose up against the wealthy. The poor said, we cannot survive like this, and there was revolution. Dickens is foretelling this. It's easy to read in the conditions in London. That's where all the poor flock to get jobs. And he's saying to the readers, look, if we don't educate, if we don't change people, it's going to result in revolution. It's just a tiny part of the novel, something that you can easily miss, but that is his political argument. Okay, now he comes to the idea of the employer's responsibility. So he's actually quite fanatical about naming sums. He tells us that Bob Cratchit earns 15 shillings a week. A shilling was called a bob, and he makes the point that Bob earns his namesake. In other words, what he's saying to the reader is, look, I've chosen Bob's name because it is the same word we use for a shilling, a bob. And I'm trying to show you, dear reader, that this is all society judges Bob at. Now, you might say, now, hang on, Mr. Salles, it's Scrooge the miser who pays Bob 15 shillings. You're right. But this is the genius that Dickens has. Scrooge is a miser by personality, but in the wages he pays, he is paying the going rate. In other words, the readers are all paying their staff at a similar rate. If Bob could get a job for more than 15 shillings doing similar work elsewhere, that's what he would do. But he sticks with Scrooge because Scrooge is paying a fair wage for the time. Now, this is why Dickens takes us to the Cratchit Christmas. He shows them suffering, making the most of their poverty. They're reusing ribbons. They're getting excited about listening to a pudding sing in the bath. I mean, that's their entertainment. The pudding steam, the steam coming out, making a whistling sound. Ooh, we get this once a year. That's the only time they can cook the pudding. They have cracked china and custard bowls with hardly any food in it. And they don't complain. In fact, they talk about how stuffed they are, but the description of the food makes it really clear that they've had hardly anything to eat. The political message there is, this is the kind of Christmas that your workers are having. They're very close to starvation levels. It's just not fair. You're going to have to pay them more. And it's not Scrooge who's being miserly here. You guys are all just as bad as Scrooge is. Next, we come to Camden Town. Now, you might not have time to put this in your essay, but the house that Bob and the Cratchits live in is the same house that Dickens lived in when he became poor. So he lived a very happy childhood with a father who was earning decent money, but then his father went into debt, was taken away and put in debtor's prison. That's when Dickens was 12. They had to move out of this house because they could no longer afford it. And Dickens was sent to work in a factory. And so that's why he sets it in his own childhood home, because he understands completely that his novel is about the moment he became poor. The novel is about poverty. That's what's uppermost in his mind. It's not just a ghost story. It's not just a hilarious caricature of a miser. He wants to change social attitudes towards poverty. So you might be able to fit that in. Interestingly, Bob works 3 miles away from Camden Town, and that was the average distance that someone in Victorian England would have to walk to their job. The reason I mention that is I want to show that Bob's job is no worse than any other Bob in London. Okay? He's definitely a representative of a normal worker paid the normal rate, because that backs up the social message that we must pay more to the people we employ. He then reinforces that message when the ghost of Christmas Future takes him to see his dead body, which he doesn't recognise because it's got a shroud over it. And he shows them nicking everything that they can that belonged to him, which is not much, and then going round to a fence, this old man, this old criminal, to sell their stuff. Now, it's very entertaining, and it's supposed to be kind of gothic and macabre and be a warning to Scrooge. But actually, it's much more a warning to society, because the charwoman, the laundress, and the undertaker's man all have full-time jobs. Why are they turning to crime? It's not because they are inherently criminal, it's because they don't have enough money in their jobs. Because, dear readers, you rich people do not pay enough to the people you employ. And the reason that they didn't is they didn't have to, because people flocked to the cities in order to gain employment, which meant there was an overabundance of people willing to do the work, so you didn't have to pay them much, because, you know, if so-and-so wanted more money, you just say, get lost, and you pay someone else less, they'd step in. And Dickens is saying, look, we can't just rely on supply and demand, because then everybody stays poor. Instead, we've got to increase the wages that we pay. You can afford it. You spent 5 shillings on this book. Yeah, that's how much he priced it at. Remember, the weekly wage for someone like Bob is 15 shillings. So this is a third of the weekly wage on a book. You can just afford to buy this, dear reader. You can pay more to the people you employ. Even the fence, this is described as an old man, and he opens the door to the parlour, which isn't a door, it's a ragged curtain. So this old man has been profiting from crime all his life, and he is still a pauper. He's still got nothing. So Dickens' point here is even crime doesn't pay. You need to pay people more. Now we come to loads of quotations from the ending. As you know, I recommend always writing about the ending, whatever text, because that's where the author reveals their final opinions. So, Scrooge becomes a second father to Tiny Tim. Yes, he saved Tiny Tim, but the reminder to the reader is you have to be like a father to the people you employ. Yeah, stop being a mercenary who just tries to pay them as little as possible. He drums home that message by then saying, yeah, I'm going to make Scrooge give money to charity, but even more importantly, he's going to take Bob aside and specifically tell him, I'm going to raise your wages, Bob, which is a message to the reader. Raise the wages that you pay. And then he's addressing the reader's fear. So let's imagine I'm particularly well off and I start paying all my house staff and the other people I employ more money. My neighbours, my acquaintances are going to laugh at me because I don't have to spend that money because I can get the workers for less. I'm paying over the odds. What kind of a mug are you, Mr. Salles? And so that's how they've reacted to Scrooge. What kind of mug are you paying all that money? He let them laugh. His own heart laughed. In other words, you will get joy from giving, is Scrooge's message to the reader. And that joy will far outweigh the cynicism of other people. Get out there, pay higher wages, make a difference. That's the point of the ending. So now you have a grade 9 essay on Scrooge's relationship with poverty, Dickens' point about poverty in the novel. Can you link any of that to charity? Yes, just change the word poverty to charity, or rather say, every time he talks about poverty, he's encouraging the reader to be more charitable in their wage giving and so on. How can we link it to joy and happiness? Easy. The problem with poverty is that it stops people having joy and experiencing happiness. Not just the poor, but also the rich do not feel true happiness because they don't get the satisfaction of making a difference. Then you're going to use exactly the same points. Fear. Well, we don't have to write about the fear of the ghosts here. We can write about the reader's fear of crime, the reader's fear of paying too much money, of being ridiculed. We can write about the social fear of the revolution that might happen if we don't pay the right wages. We can write about Scrooge's fear that Tiny Tim will die, and so on. So we can use all the same points. What if the question's about selfishness? Well, that's the same as charity, so we've kind of done that. What if it's about Christmas? Yeah. Well, I haven't mentioned Christmas once really, have I? But when does all this happen? Oh yeah, this all happens at Christmas. So all I had to do in my thesis statement is Scrooge chooses Christmas as a setting for the novel because he wants to dramatise the importance of paying fair wages and eradicating poverty. Another interesting fact for you is that he published the book at Christmas in order to reinforce that message. It's then easy when you go through all of these just to mention which ghost it is because they're all ghosts of Christmas. And so you're always addressing the Christmas question. What if the question is about the ghosts and the ghost story? Well, the ghosts appear in order to teach Scrooge this didactic lesson about social responsibility and the struggles of the poor. So it's exactly the same essay again, and you're just going to talk about the message that the ghosts deliver. So you have now got an essay to any question that can come up, unless it's just on the Cratchits. But if it is just on the Cratchits, you've got Tiny Tim, one quote there. You've got all these quotes about Tiny Tim. You've got these quotes about Bob. You've got that as a link to being a second father to Tiny Tim. And that as a link to Tiny Tim. And the Cratchits are in difficult trouble because Scrooge has failed in his Christian duty. He's a covetous old sinner. Oh my God, Mr. Salles can even use this to answer a Bob Cratchit question or a Cratchit family question. You are a genius. I'm going to subscribe forever. Good luck in the exam. Oh, what about the next video I should watch in my revision? Mr. Salles decides that this is the video because it has all the themes of A Christmas Carol in it. Check it out.